Hi, I'm Nikki Johnson, and my presentation is on CSS transitions. We'll take a look at what they are and how they're used. First, let's define a CSS transition. According to MDN Web Docs, or Mozilla, as we call it, CSS transitions provide a way to control animation speeds when changing CSS properties. Instead of having property changes take effect immediately, you can cause the changes in a property to take place over a period of time. For example, if you change the color of an element from white to black, usually the change is instantaneous. With CSS, transitions enabled, changes occur at time intervals that follow an acceleration curve, all of which can be customized in your CSS. Animations that involve transitioning between two states are often called implicit transitions, as the states in between the start and final states are implicitly defined by the browser. The image at left here is an example of what an image might look like upon loading a web page. The image at right shows the change that will occur to this image when a user hovers over it. The space between the two images illustrates the smooth transition created by CSS. CSS transitions create timed, pleasing transitions instead of the image changing from large to small abruptly. So when the user puts their cursor over this image, it doesn't just automatically pop to small. It slowly, smoothly transitions to the smaller image, so there's not that jumping around. CSS transitions enable properties to change smoothly and seamlessly during the user experience. It sort of reminds me of animation features in PowerPoint where the timing and effects are defined by the creator, then enjoyed by the user. According to W3 School, CSS transitions allow you to change property values smoothly from one value to another over a given duration. And in order to create a transition effect, you must specify two things in your CSS. You need to state the CSS property that you want to add an effect to, and also imply the duration of the effect. And if you don't do that, if you don't specify the duration part, the transition will have no effect because the default value is 0. There are 4 CSS transition properties: transition property, transition duration, transition timing function, transition delay. That should be a lowercase t on that, transition delay. But transition property specifies the name of the CSS property the transition effect is for. And this you have to include in your CSS in order for it to work. You must also specify transition duration. This specifies how many seconds or milliseconds a transition effect takes to complete. Transition timing function and transition delay are 2 additional properties that you may use to set the timing and feel of the transition, but they aren't essential for the transition to take place. They're a way of kind of fine-tuning your transition. Some common CSS transition speed curves for the transition timing function are ease, linear, ease in, ease out, ease in and out. And this is just the way that the transition occurs. So for ease, specify the transition effect with a slow start, a fast middle, and then an end that is slow. So it's easing in and out of the transition. Linear is the same speed from start to end, which based on tutorials that I read and watched, linear isn't used a lot. Ease in is a slow start. Ease out is a slow end. And ease in and out is where it starts slow and ends slow. So here's an example of how you might write the transition properties in your CSS. You would list transition property, and this one is specifically about the width of an element. The transition duration states how long it will take for that transition to occur. Transition timing function, this choice is linear, so that means the transition would occur at the same speed the entire time. You don't ease into it or out of it. And transition delay is saying that this would start 1 second after maybe it's the page load, or maybe after the hover, it's going to be delayed 1 second. And something to remember is to call in your CSS the same name that you used in your HTML. So if you wrote in your HTML div and then a specific name, you would want to write that in your CSS in order to apply those properties to that. Here's an example of how you could write a CSS transition in shorthand. You can combine all of those things into one line, width, the duration, whether the speed curve is linear or not, and the delay. You can also have multiple properties transition at the same time by separating them by a comma. So here on the transition line, you can see that we're going to be doing a transition with the background. It's going to take 2 seconds, and then also the element will be transforming and taking 2 seconds. So here we have a square that's 100 pixels wide by 100 pixels high. It has a red background, and it's going to transition on the hover from red to blue, and it's going to take 2 seconds for that to happen. And then transform with rotate means that that element is going to flip 180 degrees, and it's going to take 2 seconds for that to happen. So this is kind of that example in action. You can see the width of the box is 100 pixels by 100 pixels. That red background becomes blue, and it's taking 2 seconds for that to happen, and then transform is rotating that box. And on the rotate, you can do it on the y-axis or the x-axis. And this happens on hover. So this div says div : hover. So when the user hovers over that shape, that's when those transitions occur. A practical application for this would be anytime you add animation or element changes to a site, you can use CSS to define the transitions and how long they'll take to complete. So the actual change doesn't happen because of the CSS. That's all just in your, in how you write the code. But the actual timing between those changes is what the transition is. So say you have a click here button on your site, and it's so that people can see current specials, and maybe you want that button to rotate back and forth and be a little bit flashy and have some movement so that people see it. You can apply a CSS transition to that so that it's flipping around nice and slow. Not slow, but so that it's not just in a click, just super fast. It just makes it more visually appealing to the user, and maybe a little bit less stressful to not have it happen so abruptly. So we're going to take a look at one more example, if I can get this to work while videotaping or doing this screencast. Okay, so here in brackets I've created just some basic HTML and added in a div with a class name of box so that I can then go to my CSS, which I've called transitions.css, and call that class or talk to that class. So I have set the body here of this website, just the background color, to gray. Then I've created a yellow box. You can see here the box says background yellow. It has a width of 300 pixels and height of 300 pixels. The position is relative, so it's centered here with a margin of auto and a top of 200 pixels. Now, let's say I want to make this box purple when the user hovers over it, and maybe I want the box to turn into a circle and I want it to flip around. These are all things that we can do with CSS transitions. We can type transition property and add all of those in one line. If we'd like, we can separate them out onto separate lines or just separate them by commas. We can set the transition duration time to whatever we want. Usually with a transition, you don't want it to take longer than a second. That's a long time. So we'll just do 1 second and 3 seconds. And the timing is applied to the order of how these are. Oops, I can See a little oopsie doopsie there. Okay, so 1 second applies to the background and 3 seconds applies to border radius and transform. And then maybe we want a transition delay so that this doesn't start right when the user goes over the box. Maybe it takes a second. And then we can set a transition timing function and have it ease in and out, so where it's slow in the beginning and slow at the end. There's all different kinds of options for this, and it really just takes kind of playing with it to decide what you want. Okay, then the next thing we need to do is we need to define that we're going to be doing these transitions when a hover occurs. So we do that by calling the little box here, talking to the box. And we're going to say we want the background to change to purple. Then the border radius we'll set to 50%. And so that's like 50% of the change will happen halfway through the transition time. And then transform, we're going to rotate this shape, this square, 180 degrees. And then finish it off with a semicolon here. And, oops, I can see I need a closing bracket there. And make sure I have all my brackets. Okay. So now this should work when I hover over this little square. It's going to change into a circle. Isn't that super cool? And then when you take your mouse off of it, it goes back. Now you can actually add some other things into your CSS here that will make that shape stay a circle. So that's like a whole other ball game, but it's actually really simple. And the links that I've included on my resource page have videos for that. It's pretty cool. So that is using transition properties to animate your little changes here. So it makes them gradual. You can see how the timing works on that. Okay, so lastly, here's the list of transitional properties with identifiable halfway points. So you can use transition styling for border width, max width, opacity, all of these things listed here. Just some things to remember. HTML will support transition duration in seconds or milliseconds, but JavaScript will only support transition duration in milliseconds. So many developers opt for stating duration in milliseconds. So where this is stated in seconds right here, a lot of the research I did said to do this in milliseconds, just so that JavaScript can talk to it. And 1 second is equal to 1,000 milliseconds. You can combine transition property effects by stating transition property all, but this is hard on the CPU, which does most of the work, so it's best to separate it out by commas, as we have done here, where all of these are separated out. So I could just put all right there, and then all of these changes would happen to all of the transition properties that I have in my CSS, but it's better to list them out. And then here's my little summary. In short, CSS transitions enable you to define the transition between two states of an element. And then here are the resources. Here's a couple of videos that I watched. And then I referenced W3 Schools and MDN Web Docs. And that's it. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.